Tom Miller had always dreamed of finding a quiet place where he could focus on both his work and passion restoring vintage trucks. After years of living in the crowded city, he finally moved into a suburban neighborhood that seemed perfect for him: peaceful streets, spacious driveways, and enough room to set up his small workshop at home. He wasn't a mechanic in the traditional sense for Tom. Every old truck he worked on was a piece of history that deserved to be brought back to life. The process was more than technical, it was artistic. Every detail mattered, from the polished chrome to the hand-painted pinstripes on the body. Owning a vintage truck himself, he made it a habit to wash it every weekend, using the driveway as both a workspace and a place where he could relax, while taking care of his prized possession. For the first few weeks after moving in, everything seemed fine. The neighbors were polite, if a bit distant, but Tom didn't mind. He wasn't looking to make new friends, he just wanted peace. One particular neighbor, however, caught his attention: an older woman named Dottie Rivers, who lived across the street. She had a reputation for being overly concerned with how things looked around the neighborhood. Tom noticed her constantly inspecting other people's yards, making disapproving faces if a lawn wasn't trimmed to perfection or if a garden bed had a few weeds in it. He figured she was just one of those neighbors who liked everything neat and orderly, so he didn't pay her much mind. That changed one Saturday morning when she approached him for the first time. It was early, around 9 a.m. Tom had just pulled his vintage truck onto the driveway and started rinsing it down with a hose. The water glistened in the sunlight as it flowed over the carefully polished metal. He was about to apply the soap when he noticed Dottie standing on the sidewalk, watching him with a frown. He gave her a polite nod, thinking she was just passing by, but she didn't move. Instead, she cleared her throat loudly and called out, "Excuse me, young man." Tom turned off the hose and looked over, puzzled. "Morning," he said, keeping his tone friendly. "Can I help you with something?" Dottie stepped closer, her expression stern. "I couldn't help but notice that you're washing your truck on the driveway," she said, as if stating some grave offense. Tom raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, I do it every weekend." "Is there a problem?" She crossed her arms. "Well, as a matter of fact, yes, there is a problem. Water runoff from washing vehicles can cause damage to the street and pollute the environment. It's not something we encourage around here. In fact, it's against the neighborhood standards." Tom blinked, trying to process what he'd just heard. "Neighborhood standards? I'm not part of any association or anything like that. I own this house outright. As far as I know, there's no rule against washing my own truck on my own property." Dottie's eyes narrowed slightly. "Even if there's no formal association, we still have certain expectations around here. We care about keeping things clean and proper. You might want to consider taking your truck to a proper car wash next time, just to avoid any misunderstandings." Tom could feel his patience thinning, but he forced a smile. "Thanks for the suggestion. I'll keep that in mind." With that, he turned back to his truck and resumed his washing, hoping she would take the hint and leave. After a few more moments of standing there silently, Dottie finally walked away, muttering something under her breath that Tom couldn't make out. He shook his head, deciding to brush off the strange encounter. Everyone has that one neighbor, he thought. But the next weekend, the situation escalated. Tom was once again washing his truck when he noticed something unusual on his windshield: a folded piece of paper tucked under the wiper. Curious, he picked it up and unfolded it. What he saw made him frown. It was a handwritten notice, stating that he owed a fine of $500 for violating local water use regulations. At the bottom, it was signed Neighborhood Compliance Officer, which immediately struck Tom as odd because he had never heard of such a position in his area. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became this wasn't an official notice. It had to be Dottie's doing. She was trying to intimidate him into following her personal rules. Tom felt a mix of irritation and disbelief. Who did she think she was, trying to fine him for something so ridiculous? Still, he knew better than to react impulsively. Instead of confronting her right away, he decided to hold onto the paper and gather more information. He wanted to be sure before making any accusations. Throughout the next week, Tom noticed more signs of Dottie's interference. On Tuesday, he found another note on his mailbox, this time warning him about potential consequences if he continued to disregard neighborhood standards. On Thursday, he saw her talking to another neighbor while pointing in the direction of his house. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but the disapproving looks made it clear that he was the subject of their conversation. By Friday, Tom had had enough. He wasn't the type to let himself be pushed around, but he also knew that confronting Dottie head-on wouldn't solve anything. He needed a smarter approach, one that wouldn't just shut her down temporarily but would ensure she couldn't harass him again in the future. He spent the evening researching local property laws and regulations, trying to find anything that could support his right to wash his truck without interference. He even considered reaching out to the municipal office to report her behavior, but he decided to wait until he had more concrete evidence. As he sat in his garage that night, going over everything he had found, Tom realized something important. This wasn't just about washing his truck anymore. It was about standing up for himself. He had worked hard to buy this house, and he wasn't about to let someone like Dottie dictate what he could or couldn't do on his own property. The following weekend, Tom tried to go about his routine as usual, determined not to let Dottie's interference ruin his mood. He pulled his vintage truck onto the driveway again, ready to give it a good wash. The morning sun shone brightly, and the crisp air made it the perfect day to spend some time outdoors. He was halfway through rinsing the truck when something caught his eye: a beige sedan slowly rolling down the street toward his house. Behind the wheel, he could clearly see Dottie, peering over her steering wheel with that same disapproving frown plastered on her face. Tom ignored her, pretending not to notice as she crept past his house. He figured she was just trying to intimidate him by making her presence known. It didn't bother him much, at least not yet. After a few more minutes, the car circled back, driving by even more slowly this time. Tom couldn't help but glance up, catching her staring directly at him. He gave her a casual wave, hoping to annoy her enough that she'd drive off. But instead of leaving, Dottie pulled over to the side of the street and parked her car. Tom felt a flicker of irritation rise in his chest. Was she really about to confront him again? He had half a mind to ignore her, but before he could decide what to do, Dottie stepped out of the car, clutching a large manila envelope in her hand. Morning, she called out as she walked up the driveway, her voice overly sweet, laced with a hint of condescension. "Out washing your truck again, I see." Tom turned off the hose and wiped his hands on a nearby rag. "That's right, got to keep it clean. Something I'm sure you can appreciate." Her smile tightened, as if she were forcing herself to remain polite. "Well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I thought you should have this." She held out the manila envelope, waiting for him to take it. Tom hesitated for a moment before finally accepting it. He opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of neatly printed documents. The first page looked official, with a bold heading that read "Notice of Violation." His eyes quickly scanned the text, and what he read made his jaw clench. According to the notice, he was being fined $1,000 for unauthorized water use and environmental disruption. There was even a section that claimed his washing activities had caused damage to public property due to runoff. At the bottom of the page, there was a line for his signature, labeled "Acknowledgement of Receipt." "You've got to be kidding me," Tom muttered, flipping through the rest of the documents. There were multiple pages filled with legal jargon, none of which made any sense. Where is this even coming from? You don't have any authority to issue fines. Dottie clasped her hands together, her expression smug. "Oh, but I do. As a longtime resident of this neighborhood, I've been entrusted with maintaining our standards. We may not have a formal association, but we take pride in our community. I've spoken to several other neighbors, and they all agree that your activities are disruptive." Tom's grip on the papers tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose his temper. "Look, Dottie, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is ridiculous. You can't just make up rules and expect me to follow them. This is my property, and I'm not breaking any laws by washing my truck." Her smile didn't waver. "I suggest you take some time to think it over. Ignoring this notice won't make it go away. If you refuse to cooperate, we'll be forced to escalate the matter with that." She turned on her heel and walked back to her car, leaving Tom standing in his driveway seething. As soon as she drove off, Tom went inside and sat down at his kitchen table, spreading out the documents in front of him. He carefully read through every page, trying to make sense of what Dottie had given him. The more he read, the more absurd it became. None of the citations were backed by any actual legal authority. It was all nonsense designed to look official. Still, the fact that she had gone to such lengths to create these fake documents was troubling. It wasn't just annoying anymore, it was harassment. Determined to put an end to this nonsense, Tom decided to take action. He grabbed his phone and called the municipal office, explaining the situation to the clerk on the other end. "I just want to confirm there's no regulation against washing your own vehicle on your private property, right?" he asked. The clerk sounded confused by the question. "No, sir, there's nothing like that. As long as you're not causing any major flooding or damage to the street, you're well within your rights." Tom felt a surge of relief. "Thanks. That's all I needed to know." After hanging up, he briefly considered filing a complaint against Dottie, but he decided to hold off for now. Instead, he scanned copies of the fake violation notice and sent them to a friend who worked as a paralegal, asking for advice on how to proceed. Within an hour, his friend called back. "Yeah, this is definitely fake," she said. "There's no way this holds any legal weight. Honestly, if she keeps this up, you could report her for harassment. But if I were you, I'd try talking to her first. Maybe she'll back off if she knows you're onto her." Tom wasn't so sure about that. Dottie didn't seem like the type to back down easily. Still, he decided to give her the benefit of the doubt, one last chance to leave him alone before things escalated further. The following morning, Tom walked across the street and knocked on Dottie's door. After a few moments, she opened it, looking surprised to see him. "Oh, hello, Tom. How can I help you?" He held up the manila envelope. "We need to talk about this." Her expression hardened slightly, but she stepped aside and gestured for him to come in. Tom entered the house, noting how meticulously clean and organized everything was. He sat down at her dining table, placing the envelope in front of her. "Look, Dottie," he began, keeping his tone calm but firm. "I know this isn't real. There's no law against washing my truck, and you don't have any authority to fine me. I called the municipal office, they confirmed it. So why are you doing this?" Dottie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she picked up the envelope and flipped through the papers, as if considering her next move. Finally, she looked up at him with a cold smile. "Because, Tom, some of us care about the neighborhood. We don't want it turning into a junkyard or a car lot. If that means enforcing a few rules, even unofficial ones, then so be it." Tom leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not running a junkyard. I'm washing my truck. There's a difference." She shrugged. "Rules are rules. If you don't like them, maybe this isn't the right neighborhood for you." Tom's patience snapped. "You listen to me, Dottie. I'm not going anywhere. This is my home, and I have every right to live here without you harassing me. If you keep this up, I will take legal action. Do you understand?" For the first time, Dottie's composure faltered. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but no words came out. Finally, she gave a stiff nod. "Fine, do what you want. But don't say I didn't warn you." Tom stood up, feeling a sense of finality as he walked out the door. He didn't know if she would actually stop, but at least now she knew he wasn't going to be an easy target. Still, something told him this wasn't the end of it. Dottie didn't seem like the type to give up without a fight. Over the next few days, things seemed quiet. Too quiet, in fact. Tom kept going about his usual routine, trying not to let his confrontation with Dottie bother him too much. He knew people like her existed everywhere, those who couldn't mind their own business and tried to impose their sense of control on others. Still, a part of him remained on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Dottie might have appeared to back off during their last conversation, but her stiff, resentful expression as he walked out of her house made it clear that she didn't take kindly to being challenged. True to form, Tom continued washing his truck in his driveway that weekend. The process was almost therapeutic to him. It gave him time to clear his head while working on something he loved. The air smelled fresh, the sun reflected brightly off the clean chrome of his truck, and for a moment everything felt normal again. That is, until he heard the sound of a car pulling up. He turned his head slightly, expecting to see a delivery truck or a passing neighbor, but instead he saw a small white sedan with an unfamiliar logo on the side pulling into his driveway. Two men in gray uniforms stepped out, each carrying a clipboard. "Can I help you?" Tom called out, setting down the hose and walking toward them. He could already feel a knot forming in his stomach. Something about the way they carried themselves screamed bureaucratic hassle. One of the men, a stocky guy with a neatly trimmed mustache, stepped forward and offered a curt nod. "Good morning, sir. We're here to conduct an inspection." Tom raised an eyebrow. "An inspection?" "Of what, exactly?" "Of your property," the man replied matter-of-factly. "We received a complaint regarding potential violations of local ordinances, specifically concerning water usage and environmental runoff." Tom crossed his arms, irritation prickling at the back of his neck. He didn't need to guess who filed the complaint. This had Dottie written all over it. "I see. And what ordinances, exactly, am I supposed to have violated?" The second man, taller and younger looking, stepped forward and handed Tom a sheet of paper. It listed a series of vaguely worded regulations about water conservation and storm drain protection, none of which seemed directly applicable to washing a vehicle on private property. Still, Tom knew better than to brush this off completely. These guys might have been sent by Dottie, but they looked official enough that ignoring them could lead to more trouble down the line. "Look," Tom said, keeping his tone calm but firm. "I already checked with the municipal office, and they confirmed that washing a personal vehicle on private property is completely legal. So unless you have something more concrete than this vague list of potential violations, I don't see why you need to inspect anything." The stocky man's expression didn't change. He glanced down at his clipboard, then back at Tom. "We're just doing our job, sir. If everything's in order, this won't take long." Reluctantly, Tom stepped aside, allowing them to walk around his property. He kept a close eye on them as they moved, noting how they seemed more interested in jotting down notes and taking photos than actually inspecting anything. It was clear to him that they weren't looking for real violations. They were trying to create a case out of nothing. After about 20 minutes, the men returned to their car without saying much. Tom stood by the driveway, waiting for some kind of explanation. Finally, the stocky man spoke again. "You'll be hearing from us soon," he said. "In the meantime, I'd recommend refraining from any activities that could exacerbate the situation." Tom's jaw tightened. "Right. Thanks for the advice." He watched as they got into their car and drove off, frustration simmering just beneath the surface. This was exactly the kind of petty harassment he'd expected from Dottie, but seeing it play out like this still left him fuming. She wasn't just trying to annoy him, she was actively trying to make his life difficult by involving outside forces. That evening, Tom sat in his garage, trying to figure out his next move. He knew he couldn't just ignore what had happened. Dottie had escalated the situation by involving these so-called inspectors, and if he didn't push back, she would only keep going. He considered calling the municipal office again to report the incident, but he wasn't sure how much help they would be. Instead, he decided to do something a bit more proactive. He reached out to his lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Rachel, who had helped him with the purchase of his property. After explaining the situation, Rachel sighed on the other end of the line. "Sounds like you've got yourself a classic case of a difficult neighbor," she said. "Unfortunately, these things happen more often than you'd think. The good news is, if you're not actually breaking any laws, they don't have much to stand on. I'll draft a formal notice to send to the inspectors, requesting clarification on the basis of their visit. If they can't provide a legitimate reason, we can consider taking further action." "Thanks, Rachel." "I appreciate it," Tom said. "I just want to make sure they don't show up unannounced again." "I get it," she replied. "Leave it with me. I'll handle it." With that taken care of, Tom felt a bit more at ease. He knew it wouldn't solve the problem entirely, but at least he was taking steps to protect himself. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that Dottie had something else up her sleeve. She didn't strike him as someone who gave up easily. Sure enough, the next morning brought another surprise. As Tom walked out to get his mail, he noticed something new on the side of the road. Near his property, several small signs had been planted along the curb, each one reading "Private Neighborhood Strict Regulations Apply." He stared at the signs, a mix of disbelief and anger bubbling up inside him. They hadn't been there the day before. which meant someone, most likely Dottie, had put them up overnight. Tom took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he pulled out his phone and took photos of the signs from multiple angles, making sure to document their placement. Once he had enough evidence, he sent the photos to Rachel, along with a brief explanation of what had happened. A few hours later, Rachel called him back. "This is definitely harassment," she said. "Those signs aren't legally enforceable, and whoever put them up didn't go through the proper channels. I'll include this in our formal notice as well." "Great," Tom replied. "Do you think it's worth reporting this to the police?" "It wouldn't hurt," Rachel said. "Even if they can't do much right now, it'll create a record of the incidents in case things escalate further." Following her advice, Tom went down to the local police station and filed a report. The officer on duty listened patiently as he explained the situation and took down the details. While the officer admitted there wasn't much they could do at the moment, he assured Tom that the report would be on file if any future issues arose. By the time Tom returned home, he felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. He hadn't asked for any of this, but now that it was happening, he wasn't about to back down. This was his home, his property, and he wasn't going to let anyone push him around. As the sun set that evening, Tom stood in his driveway, looking out at the street. The signs were still there, standing like silent sentinels, but they didn't intimidate him anymore. If Dottie wanted a fight, she was going to get one. But it wouldn't be on her terms, it would be on his. The following week, things took a turn Tom hadn't anticipated. After filing his report with the police and sending Rachel everything she needed to handle the so-called inspection and the signs, he expected things to calm down. Maybe Dottie would get the message and finally back off, realizing that he wasn't someone she could bully without consequences. But unsurprisingly, Dottie wasn't the type to give up so easily. She escalated things yet again, only this time it wasn't just petty intimidation, it was a direct attack on his reputation. It started on a Wednesday morning when Tom received a phone call from a local contractor he had hired to do some landscaping work around his property. The contractor, a man named Mike, sounded uneasy. "Hey Tom, I just got a weird call from someone claiming to represent your neighborhood. They said there were concerns about your property and implied I shouldn't do any work for you, unless I wanted to deal with some kind of permit trouble. They didn't say who they were, but it sounded pretty serious." Tom's stomach tightened. He didn't need 3 guesses to figure out who was behind the call. Did they give a name or any contact info? No, but they said they were part of some neighborhood compliance group. I've never heard of anything like that before. And it sounded fishy. "Thought I'd give you a heads up." "Thanks for letting me know," Mike, Tom said, doing his best to keep his tone even. "There's no real compliance group, just one overzealous neighbor trying to stir up trouble. Don't worry about any of it. Your work here is perfectly legal." Mike hesitated for a moment before answering. "Okay, if you're sure. I'll still come by tomorrow as planned, but you might want to keep an eye on things. This kind of stuff can get ugly fast." Tom hung up, his irritation growing. He had expected Dottie to continue her petty harassment, but trying to interfere with his business and scare off contractors was a new low. This wasn't just about annoying him anymore, this was about control. She was trying to make his life difficult in every possible way, and if he didn't put a stop to it soon, who knew how far she would go. Later that day, Tom walked around his property, checking to see if there were any more signs of Dottie's interference. To his surprise, everything seemed normal, no more signs had been planted, and there were no strange cars parked nearby. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Dottie wasn't the kind of person to give up after just one setback. If anything, she was likely planning her next move. Sure enough, that evening, Tom received another unexpected visitor. This time, it wasn't an inspector or a contractor, it was one of his neighbors, a man named Carl. Carl was in his late 40s, with a friendly demeanor and a no-nonsense attitude that Tom had always appreciated. They'd exchanged a few words here and there since Tom moved in, but they weren't particularly close. "Hey Tom," Carl said, walking up the driveway with his hands in his pockets. "Got a minute? Thought we should talk." Tom wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. "Sure. What's up?" Carl glanced around as if checking to make sure they weren't being watched, before lowering his voice. Look, I don't want to get in the middle of anything, but word's been going around that you're causing problems in the neighborhood. Dottie's been talking to people, saying you're breaking rules and causing issues with water runoff. A few folks are starting to take her side. Tom clenched his jaw, doing his best to stay calm. What exactly is she telling them? Carl shrugged. Mostly the same stuff she told you, I'd guess. That you're washing your truck too often, that it's messing up the street, and that you're refusing to follow neighborhood standards. She's making it sound like you're some kind of nuisance. I figured you should know, in case it gets worse. Thanks for letting me know, Carl. I appreciate it. Carl hesitated for a moment before speaking again. Look, I know you're not doing anything wrong, and honestly, most of us don't care what you do with your own property. But Dottie's got a way of stirring things up. She's done it before with other neighbors' people who didn't fit in according to her. Just watch your back, okay? And if you need someone to back you up, you can count on me. Tom felt a flicker of gratitude. Thanks, Carl. I'll keep that in mind. After Carl left, Tom stood in his driveway, thinking over what he had just heard. Dottie wasn't just harassing him directly anymore, she was trying to turn the entire neighborhood against him. This wasn't a fight he could win by ignoring her. He needed to take action, but he needed to be smart about it. Confronting her head-on wouldn't do any good, it would only make him look like the bad guy. No, he needed a different approach, one that would expose her behavior for what it really was, bullying. The next morning, Tom got to work. He started by gathering every piece of documentation. He had copies of the fake violation notices, photos of the signs Dottie had planted, and the call log from the contractor who had been threatened. He organized everything neatly into a file, making sure it was all ready to present if needed. Then he called Rachel to update her on the situation. Sounds like things are escalating, Rachel said after he explained what had happened. Good thing you've been documenting everything. If Dottie keeps this up, we'll have a strong case for harassment. Yeah, but I don't just want to stop her, I want to make sure she can't pull this kind of stunt on anyone else. Any ideas? Rachel thought for a moment before replying. You could file a formal complaint with the municipal office. They won't do much right away, but it'll create a record of her behavior. If enough people file complaints, they might eventually take action. You could also consider talking to other neighbors if Dottie's harassed them in the past. They might be willing to support you. Tom nodded, already forming a plan in his mind. I'll start with the complaint. As for the neighbors, I think I know who to talk to. That afternoon, Tom went door to door, speaking with some of the neighbors Carl had mentioned. Most of them were hesitant to get involved, not wanting to draw Dottie's ire, but a few admitted that they had their own issues with her in the past. One elderly couple even shared a story about how Dottie had tried to fine them for having unauthorized garden decorations in their front yard. By the end of the day, Tom had gathered enough support to feel confident moving forward. He filed the complaint with the municipal office, including all the evidence he had collected, and encouraged the other neighbors to do the same. It wasn't a guaranteed solution, but it was a start. As the sun set, Tom stood in his driveway once again, watching the quiet street in front of him. He knew the fight wasn't over yet. Dottie wasn't the type to back down easily. But for the first time since this whole mess began, he felt like he had the upper hand. He wasn't just reacting anymore, he was taking control. And if Dottie wanted to keep playing games, she was about to find out that Tom wasn't someone who gave up without a fight. The days following Tom's complaint to the municipal office were tense but strangely quiet. Dottie hadn't made any direct moves against him since he spoke to Carl and gathered the support of a few other neighbors. Tom knew better than to assume she had given up. If anything, the silence only made him more suspicious. He stayed vigilant, keeping an eye on his property and waiting for the next attempt to make his life difficult. He didn't have to wait long. It started late one night, just after Tom had gone to bed. The distant sound of a car engine approaching slowly down the street made him stir. He sat up, listening closely as the engine grew louder before stopping near his driveway. He pulled back the curtain and peered outside, but the streetlights didn't reach far enough to give him a clear view. All he could make out were two dim figures standing near the curb. A minute later, the engine started again, and the car drove off into the night. The next morning, Tom stepped outside and immediately noticed something unusual. His front lawn was covered in small metal stakes, each tied with red plastic ribbons fluttering in the breeze. He walked over to inspect them more closely and saw that some of the stakes were placed dangerously close to his driveway, as if marking off sections of his property. Next to the stakes was a printed sign staked into the ground, reading Property Evaluation in Progress Future Community Development Site. Tom stared at the sign, his anger quickly rising. This was something new. He had dealt with Dottie's fake fines and petty harassment, but this felt more serious. It wasn't just about making his life inconvenient anymore. It looked like she was trying to undermine his ownership of the property itself. He pulled out his phone, took several pictures of the stakes and the sign, and immediately called Rachel. "Rachel, it's me again. You're not going to believe this," he said as soon as she picked up. "What happened now?" Rachel asked, her tone a mix of concern and exasperation. "There are stakes all over my lawn with a sign saying this is a future community development site. It looks like someone's trying to mark off parts of my property for some kind of fake project." Rachel was silent for a moment, processing what he'd said. "That's bold. Do you know who's behind it?" "I can take a wild guess," Tom muttered. "This is Dottie written all over it. She's escalating again, trying to scare me into thinking my property's at risk." "Okay, here's what we're going to do," Rachel said, her voice steady and decisive. "First, I want you to document everything: photos, videos, timestamps. Then, we'll file another formal complaint. This time for illegal property interference. I'll also check if there are any recent permit requests or applications for development in your area. If she's trying to fake something official, we'll find out." Tom thanked her and hung up, feeling slightly better now that he had a plan. He spent the next hour walking around his property, carefully photographing every stake, every ribbon, and the sign. He even measured the distances between the stakes in his driveway to show how far they had encroached on his land. Once he had everything documented, he sent the files to Rachel and waited for her to get back to him. Later that afternoon, as Tom was working in his garage, he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up and saw Dottie standing at the edge of his driveway, her hands clasped behind her back and a smug smile on her face. It was the first time he had seen her since their last confrontation, and she looked entirely too pleased with herself. "Afternoon, Tom," she said sweetly. "I see you noticed the stakes." Tom set down his wrench and walked over, keeping his expression neutral. "Yeah, I noticed. Care to explain what they're doing on my property?" "Oh, it's nothing to worry about," Dottie said with an air of feigned innocence. "There's been talk of future improvements in the area, and I thought it would be a good idea to mark out potential sites for evaluation. Just trying to do my part for the neighborhood, you understand." "Future improvements," Tom repeated, incredulous. "There's no project, no evaluation, and no development planned here. You made this up." Dottie's smile didn't falter. "You seem awfully sure of that. But if you're so certain, I'm sure the appropriate authorities will back you up. Until then, those stakes stay where they are." Tom took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Listen carefully, Dottie. You've crossed the line. This isn't just petty harassment anymore. You're interfering with my property, and I've already filed a complaint. If those stakes aren't gone by tomorrow, I'll have the police here, and I won't stop until you're held accountable for this." Dottie's smile finally slipped, replaced by a cold, hard stare. "You always were difficult," she muttered. "I warned you, Tom. This could have been handled amicably, but you chose to be stubborn. Fine. Let's see how far you get." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back across the street. Tom watched her go, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and frustration. He knew she wasn't bluffing. Dottie was the type to double down when challenged. He needed to be ready for whatever came next. That evening, Rachel called back with some interesting news. "I checked with the municipal office. There are no permits or applications for any development in your area. Whatever Dottie's trying to pull, it's completely unauthorized." "Good," Tom said. "What's our next move?" "I'm drafting a cease and desist letter. Once she receives it, she'll be legally obligated to stop interfering with your property. If she doesn't, we can escalate to a lawsuit. In the meantime, I'd suggest keeping a close eye on things. People like her don't always play by the rules." Tom agreed, feeling a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't going to let Dottie intimidate him or trick him into giving up. This was his home, and he had every right to defend it. That night, Tom went to bed feeling more prepared than he had in weeks. But just as he was beginning to drift off to sleep, he was jolted awake by a loud noise outside. He jumped out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and hurried to the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. Someone had knocked over his trash cans and scattered garbage across his lawn. In the distance, he thought he saw a shadowy figure disappearing around the corner. Tom didn't sleep much after that. He spent the rest of the night on edge, listening for any more sounds of movement outside. By morning, he was exhausted but determined. If Dottie thought she could scare him into submission, she was in for a rude awakening. The next day, Tom installed motion sensor lights around his property, ensuring that any future intruders would be caught in the act. He also placed a call to the local police, updating them on the latest incident and providing them with the photos and documentation Rachel had advised him to collect. As he stood in his driveway later that afternoon, watching the newly installed lights flicker on and off as they adjusted to the movement of leaves in the wind, Tom felt a sense of grim satisfaction. He wasn't just defending himself anymore, he was taking back control. Dottie could keep playing her games, but he wasn't going anywhere. If she wanted a fight, he was more than ready to give her one. The tension reached its breaking point just a few days later. Tom had hoped that after receiving Rachel's cease and desist letter, Dottie would finally back down and stop interfering with his life. But instead, she did what he should have expected. She escalated things even further. Early on a Thursday morning, as Tom stepped outside to grab the newspaper, he noticed something strange. Several of his newly installed motion sensor lights had been smashed. The glass lay shattered on the ground, and the metal casings were bent and dented. It was clear that someone had deliberately destroyed them. His jaw clenched in frustration. He didn't need to guess who was responsible, but proving it was another matter entirely. Just as he was inspecting the damage, a familiar voice called out from across the street. "Morning, Tom. Looks like you've had a bit of trouble." Dottie's tone was dripping with mock concern, and the smug expression on her face only fueled his growing anger. Tom straightened up, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose his cool. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about this, would you?" he asked, his voice steady but cold. Dottie's smile widened just a little. "Oh, of course not. But it's a shame, really. Those lights were such an eyesore, didn't fit the aesthetic of the neighborhood, you know." Tom didn't respond. He simply turned and walked back toward his garage, determined to stay focused. Losing his temper now would only give Dottie more ammunition to use against him. He knew she was trying to provoke him into making a mistake, but he wouldn't fall for it. Instead, he went inside and immediately called Rachel to update her on the situation. "She smashed your lights?" "That's blatant vandalism," Rachel said, her frustration evident. "We need to act fast. File another police report, and I'll follow up with them to push for an investigation. This has gone beyond harassment now, it's criminal." Tom agreed and hung up. He filed the report as Rachel suggested, and by noon a police officer arrived to take his statement and photograph the damage. While the officer was professional and polite, Tom could sense the underlying skepticism in his tone. Without direct evidence or witnesses, it would be difficult to prove that Dottie was behind the vandalism. Still, filing the report was better than doing nothing. By the time the officer left, Tom was feeling more determined than ever. Dottie thought she could intimidate him into giving up, but she underestimated his resolve. He wasn't just going to sit back and let her ruin his life, he was going to take control of the situation once and for all. Later that afternoon, Rachel called back with more news. "I spoke with the municipal office again," she said. "It turns out Dottie's been filing multiple complaints against you, everything from noise violations to supposed water misuse. None of them have gone anywhere because there's no real evidence. But it shows how far she's willing to go. She's trying to create a paper trail to paint you as a troublemaker." Tom wasn't surprised. It was exactly the kind of underhanded tactic he expected from her. "So what do we do?" "We hit back," Rachel said firmly. "I've drafted a formal demand for mediation. It's not optional. Once she receives it, she'll be legally required to attend a mediation session with a neutral third party. If she refuses, it'll strengthen our case if we end up taking this to court. But I have a feeling she'll show up, if only to keep up appearances. The idea of sitting down in a room with Dottie and trying to talk things out didn't exactly appeal to Tom, but he trusted Rachel's judgment. If this was the best way to resolve things without dragging it out further, he was willing to try. 2 days later, the mediation session was set. They met in a small conference room at a local legal office. Rachel was at Tom's side, calm and professional as always, while Dottie arrived alone, dressed impeccably in a sharp blazer and clutching a thick folder of papers. She didn't look the least bit intimidated. In fact, she seemed almost amused by the whole situation. The mediator, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, began by laying out the ground rules. Both parties would have a chance to present their side of the story, and the goal was to reach a mutually agreeable resolution. Tom let Rachel do most of the talking, watching as she calmly and methodically laid out the facts: the fake violation notices, the illegal property markers, the repeated harassment, and now the vandalism. When it was Dottie's turn to speak, she launched into a rehearsed-sounding speech about preserving the integrity of the neighborhood and upholding community standards. She tried to paint Tom as a disruptive newcomer who didn't respect the established way of life in the area. Rachel remained unfazed. With all due respect, Ms. Rivers, your personal opinions about how the neighborhood should look don't give you the right to harass my client or interfere with his property. The evidence speaks for itself, unless you have something concrete to refute these claims. I suggest we focus on finding a real solution. Dottie bristled at Rachel's words, but she didn't have a strong response. After a tense back and forth, the mediator intervened, urging both sides to come to an agreement. Eventually, under pressure, Dottie reluctantly agreed to cease all contact with Tom and to stop any further attempts to interfere with his property. It wasn't the perfect outcome Tom had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. As they left the mediation room, Tom felt a sense of relief mixed with lingering frustration. He knew Dottie well enough by now to realize that she might not honor the agreement, but at least he had taken a stand and forced her to face the consequences of her actions. That evening, as he stood in his driveway watching the sunset, Tom allowed himself a moment to reflect. The past few weeks had been exhausting physically, mentally, and emotionally, but through it all, he had refused to be bullied or intimidated. He had stood his ground, taken smart, measured actions, and with Rachel's help, he had managed to push back against someone who thought they could control him. He didn't know what the future held, whether Dottie would really leave him alone, or if this would all flare up again in time. But one thing was certain: he wasn't going anywhere. This was his home, and he had every right to live in peace. If anyone tried to take that away from him, they would learn the same lesson Dottie had just learned: Tom Miller wasn't someone who could be pushed around. In the days following the mediation, Tom noticed a marked difference in the atmosphere around the neighborhood. For the first time in weeks, there were no unexpected visits from inspectors, no strange signs appearing on his lawn, and no more attempts by Dottie to interfere with his daily life. It was as if a tense, invisible cloud that had hung over his home had finally lifted. Still, Tom wasn't the type to relax too easily. He kept an eye on things, half expecting Dottie to pull something new, but for now everything remained calm. A few neighbors even started being more friendly. Carl stopped by one afternoon to check in and chat, and a couple who lived down the street waved at Tom as they passed by. It seemed that word of the mediation had spread, and people were starting to see Dottie for what she really was: a busybody who had crossed too many lines. Tom didn't care much about gaining popularity, but it was a small comfort to know that he wasn't isolated anymore. If Dottie ever tried something again, she would have a harder time rallying the neighborhood against him. Rachel, ever the professional, followed up with Tom a week later to make sure everything was still going smoothly. "How's it been? Any more trouble from your favorite neighbor?" she asked with a hint of dry humor. "Quiet as a mouse," Tom replied. "I think the mediation rattled her enough to keep her in check, at least for now." "Good. But if anything happens, you know what to do. Keep documenting, call the police if necessary, and let me know right away." "Will do." "Thanks for everything, Rachel. I couldn't have handled this without you, any time. And remember, you didn't just stand up for yourself. You sent a message. People like her thrive on fear and compliance. When you push back, they lose their power. Tom appreciated Rachel's words, but deep down he still couldn't help feeling that Dottie wasn't done with him yet. People like her rarely changed overnight. She might have been forced into a temporary truce, but the resentment still simmered beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to boil over. For now, though, he was content to enjoy the peace while it lasted. A few weeks later, Tom finally got back to what he loved most, working on his vintage truck without interruptions. The restoration project had been on hold for too long, and he was eager to dive back in. He spent the morning polishing the chrome and fine-tuning the engine, losing himself in the familiar rhythm of his work. The driveway, once a battleground for a petty feud, now felt like a sanctuary again. Just as he was finishing up for the day, Carl stopped by again, this time bringing a six-pack of beer. "Figured you could use a drink after all the crap you've been through," Carl said with a grin. Tom laughed and accepted the offer. "Thanks, man. I could definitely use one." As they sat on Tom's porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Carl brought up something that caught Tom off guard. "You know, a few of us have been talking. We're thinking of setting up some kind of informal neighborhood group, not like an official association, just something where we can look out for each other and keep things peaceful. Would you be interested?" Tom raised an eyebrow. The idea of joining any kind of neighborhood group didn't exactly appeal to him, but he could see the logic in it. If people banded together in a positive way, it could prevent someone like Dottie from ever trying to take control again. "I'll think about it," he said after a moment. "As long as it's not about making up rules to control everyone, I might be on board." "Fair enough," Carl said, taking a sip of his beer. "We just want to make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else." As the evening wore on, Tom felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: relief. It wasn't just that Dottie had been quiet. It was the realization that he didn't have to face everything alone. The neighborhood might have started out as a source of stress and conflict, but now it felt like a place where he could finally put down roots. He didn't need to be best friends with everyone, but knowing there were people willing to stand by him made all the difference. By the time Carl left, Tom was feeling more at ease than he had in a long time. He finished the last of his beer, leaned back in his chair, and watched the stars begin to dot the night sky. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could sit back and enjoy the simple peace of his home. The battle with Dottie might not have been the way he imagined starting his life in this neighborhood, but in a strange way, it had helped him find his place. He had stood his ground, refused to be pushed around, and earned the respect of those around him. More importantly, he had learned something about himself. No matter how hard someone tried to control him, he had the strength to fight back and protect what was his. As he sat there in the quiet of the night, Tom knew one thing for sure: this was his home, and no one was going to take that from him. Not Dottie, not anyone. The future might bring more challenges, but whatever came next, he was ready. He had already fought one battle and won, and he was prepared to do it again if he had to. For now, though, he was content to enjoy the victory. He had earned it.